Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 6, chapter 6. I'm Professor Rios, and this week we move on to the other side of the world. So, done with North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, and moving on to Sub-Saharan Africa. So, the biggest continent outside of Eurasia. And so it's basically this region south. So it's sub or south of the Sahara Desert. It's a really, really big area, really super complicated, one of the more unique regions of the world for a very specific reason, quite frankly. So we'll get into that. Hope you're doing well. Let's first do the Google Earth tour. So let me maximize this. As you can see here, so Sub-Saharan Africa, all the way from the tip of South Africa, Madagascar, the Horn of Africa, which is Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, Eritrea, eastward through South Sudan, the world's newest country, Central African Republic, Chad, and all the way to equatorial Atlantic Africa. So it includes the area of the world that gets the most thunderstorms in the world, one of the 3 big tropical rainforests on Earth, the Congo. It is a region that has, of course, a desert in the Kalahari down here in Namibia and Botswana and parts of South Africa. It has interesting countries like Lesotho and Eswatini, which are like these small countries that are basically within countries. So it's almost like a country inside of another country. It has some very interesting geographical features like the Great Rift Valley of Africa, which extends through this whole region of lakes. Africa is basically ripping apart and becoming larger as it extends. So from a plate tectonics perspective, this part of Africa is moving away from that part of Africa. Of course, you have a very complicated colonial, tribal, ethnic, political history here. So it is unique, complicated, interesting, infuriating, amazing. There's all kinds of descriptors that you could give this region. Africa is probably on its way to becoming the manufacturing capital of the world eventually. China is no longer going to be that. They are divesting themselves of that. And so, as they become more and more developed, a lot of what was made in China will eventually be made in Africa. Not quite there yet, but it will happen at some point in the not too distant future. China is doing a lot of investing in this part of the world. So, again, very interesting region from finding a desert at the equator here in Somalia, an area that's affected by piracy, modern day piracy through Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania. Of course, in Africa, you find the tallest mountain in the continent and the tallest mountain found near the equator, and that would be Mount Kilimanjaro, which is found in this area that is so unique. You have Mount Kenya, for example, there. Kilimanjaro is, oh, of course, I can't find it now, but let's do a quick search. There we go. There you go. I know I wasn't too far from it. So there's Kilimanjaro. And it is a national park, and it is the tallest mountain in the entire continent at over 19,000 feet of elevation. Notice there are glaciers on top of it. That's because it is that high. So even though you're at the equator, you can find snow and really cold weather at that elevation. If you zoom out, you really begin to see that there's forests surrounding it at lower elevations, and eventually, if you really pull out, here's sort of a three-dimensional look at it. You go from temperate forest to pine forest to tundra to, of course, the top of the mountain, which is basically an e-climate or something that is sort of unique to the area. It is a very often climbed mountain because it's not as difficult as say, a Mount Everest, but it is a very, very popular place for mountain climbers of lower sort of expectations. You don't need as much oxygen and equipment to make it that far up at the equator. All right. Of course, you have different areas. The Congo, lots of rainfall here. Gabon, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cameroon, Nigeria. So lots and lots of heavy rainfall here. The darker the green, the more rain it gets, and the lighter the green, the less rain it gets. And eventually you get to areas that are sort of green-brown, meaning that those have seasonal patterns of rainfall, and we'll get into that. All right, so enough on Google Earth. I wanted to at least highlight that. Let's get into the actual lesson. And there is that mountain again, Mount Kilimanjaro. And here you see sort of very African view image, herds of elephants, the acacia tree, which is very fan-like, in a very warm tropical climate where this picture was taken, a climate. But here you see the snow-capped Mount Kilimanjaro at 19,000 feet in the distance. The learning objectives. Some of the concepts. So again, broken up into 48 states and one territory. It has similar livelihood systems of agriculture and the colonial past, whether that colonial past is French, Portuguese, British, German, Dutch, whatever the case might be, there is a colonial legacy there. The population is really what makes the area unique. It is still very rural, it's still very young, and it's really the only area of the world that is still growing fast. That's it. It's the only region that you can say is explosively growing as of 2021, and it will still be the case through the 2020s. Okay. The challenges are pretty unique and similar throughout the region. Again, it has a very extensive physical landscape. Remember, if you look at the Earth from the perspective of a globe, a country like, or an island like Greenland fits inside of Africa 13 times. And here's a good example. You can fit pretty much all of China, India, the United States, and Europe inside of Africa. That's how big it is. The United States is a big country. If you are from the US and you have traveled extensively, you know that. The US is big. Yet, Africa is 2.5 times the size of the United States. That's how big the continent of Africa is. And you really can't see it in this map because this map is not a perfect projection. Remember, the only real representation of Earth is a globe. Africa is very young. This is a slightly dated map, but it's still pretty applicable. Huge percentages of Sub-Saharan Africa are 42 to 50% under the age of 15. That's very different from the United States, Canada, Europe, China, Australia. So that is an area of the country, area of the world rather, that is still very young. This is still a big deal in Africa. The idea of Sub-Saharan subsistence systems, meaning the agriculture that you perform in order to feed yourself and those within your immediate vicinity. And in Africa, interestingly enough, the majority of farmers are women, not men. Sub-Saharan Africa as a share of domestic product, and this is pretty old. I will give you that. This graphic is not particularly current, but it's still applicable. So the basic idea of the graphic is still true, that as a percentage of gross domestic product in Sub-Saharan Africa, the percentages are simply higher. Agriculture makes up a larger percentage of the overall economy. The physical landscape, one of the more interesting regions, is what's called the Okavango. It is an interior delta system. It's unique. There is no other place like it in the world. It is found in Sub-Saharan Africa in the south, and it looks like a little chicken leg. And basically, if this were not a desert, this would simply be a lake. Really, that's the only difference. The problem is it rains a lot here in Angola, and the rain literally just drains into the low spot. It would otherwise be just a river feeding a lake. The only problem is because this is such a dry area, it only becomes wet when this area up here is wet. And when this area dries up a bit, this dries up entirely. So this is what it looks like from space. Notice how it's sort of shining with the sun directly above it. It is, again, an area of interior drainage, and it is responsible for some of the biggest migration movement of animals anywhere on Earth. They basically follow the water. So the animals move either in this direction or in this direction, depending on the time of year. Climate. If I had to use a word to describe the African climate, seasonality would be one of them. Unless you find yourself right in the middle of the continent, right at the equator, where it's always wet, tropical, rainy, right here, that color, AF. Africa has a lot of seasonality, and you can see that in the peaks of rainfall that you find. You find it in South Africa, you find it in Mali, Nigeria, you find it in Kenya, in Zambia, you find it pretty much everywhere, with the exception of those areas where the climate is considered tropical rainy, meaning it's raining the entire year. There is no dry season. So that's a big deal because a lot of these places where the climate is a little wet during the summer, when the season ends, that's it. There's no more rain coming. So you have to do your agriculture and you have to do all your food storage during that time of the year because the dry season will then follow. So these are some of the biomes or biogeographical regions that you find. Of course, tropical rainforest, that would be found here in this AF climate. And, no big surprise, jungles, tall trees, heavy rainfall, that happens a lot. Savanna, which is a dry, wet climate, so it rains enough to support some vegetation. So if you look at this, that would be the AW climate. Tropical, wet, and dry. And then, of course, deserts. That's pretty self-explanatory. That would be the BW climate. So in Africa, that would simply be up here or down here. Okay? So those are the main three African biomes, and they each affect daily life in a very unique way. If you live in the desert, the struggle for water is real. If you live in the tropical jungle, water isn't really that big of an issue. However, other issues become forefront as far as challenges to daily life. Some of the environmental issues, of course, deforestation is a big deal. Water is always a big deal in this part of the world because there aren't any significantly large either aquifers that are being tapped into and or delivery systems for water. Until desalination becomes a less energy intensive and cheaper enterprise, which will eventually come to be, desalination is not really a process that is widely used in this continent. The Sahel. The Sahel is one of the more delicate and vulnerable regions of Africa. That is what the Sahel looks like. The Sahel would be that bluish, greenish band that you see there. It's not really tropical desert. It's not really tropical rainforest. It's in between. See it? It rains enough because there's grass and trees, but it doesn't rain enough to be a tropical jungle. So it's sort of in the middle. It's seasonal. It has a bump of rainfall primarily during the months of June, July, and August. So the Sahel is defined as an ecotone. And that's just a fancy term for saying that it is a transition zone lying between the desert to the north and the wetter regions to the south. Again, characterized by a long dry season and a short wet season during which all agriculture has to take place. There's unfortunately one river system called the Niger, which flows from a wet area into a dry area, back through a wet area. And then you can see that in March and September, so that would be before the wet season. After the wet season, the rainfall patterns shift with the sun, and so do the precipitation and vegetation patterns that follow. So notice how the green or vegetation shifted north. The Sahel has challenges that are both physical and human. The physical is what you see here. You know, it's big, it's about a third the size of the US. It has a lot of people. It has a system of rivers that's just two basic river systems. It has a seasonal climate, and it has desertification as a challenge. It also has cultural issues that are superimposed. So we're talking about boundaries that were imposed by colonial powers, the intersection of religion, young populations, and very, very stark tribal differences in religion and language. So as a result, these issues become magnified in an area that is already sort of teetering on the edge of either something good or something bad. So if you want to think about climate change and variability in this area, what it means is climate change is like a tipping point. So imagine that it can affect human security. Think about migration, borders, terror actors. You know, the idea of climate refugees, that's going to become a bigger and bigger issue in this century. Economic insecurity, so the reliance of countries on non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Think of UNICEF. Think about Doctors Without Borders. Health, disease, the things that carry disease like mosquitoes and ticks and flies, food, and water. So these are the big security concerns that really any place has to worry about. And then all of these are connected. So health security and food security are connected because if there's less food security, people's health is at risk. If water security is affected, it affects human security because people need water to live. In addition to that, you need water to grow food. And if you can't grow food because you have no water, your economic stature suffers. So all these are connected with one another, which is what I'm trying to get at with this sort of rather complicated, but rather simple graphic, quite frankly. All these securities are really made worse by climate change and variability because they take a country away from their sort of normal path. So now, there's a couple of videos. They are all posted on your class page. So this one on fighting erosion and desertification in Sub-Saharan Africa, Africa's Green Project, and the Green Wall. And these are available again on your class page for the week. And I highly recommend you watch them. They're not particularly long. And again, they bring the material sort of outside the textbook. Deforestation is a big deal. Deforestation in many parts of the world, but especially in Sub-Saharan Africa and Central America, is what's called slash and burn. And deforestation seen from space looks like this. This should be a tropical rainforest. And here you see all the dirt that's being washed away from the island of Madagascar. Basically, the island is bleeding soil into the Indian Ocean. Those beaches should be clear. It should be beautiful, crystalline water. But as a result of deforestation, when the rains fall, they can easily strip away dirt and dump it into the ocean. Climate change vulnerability. Again, this region is the lowest emitter of greenhouse gases, but they are the most vulnerable. And as a result of, whether it's poverty or limited resources or over-dependent on rain-fed agriculture, this area is very, very vulnerable to any tweaks that climate change may impose on what is considered normal. Food insecurity is probably one of the biggest issues, but again, remember that graphic before, that is tied to climate change as a function of water, as a function of economics, as a function of health. Population, we said earlier that this region has the highest fertility in the world, but it has begun to decline. So even this area, which is the fastest growing area of the world, has begun to slowly slow down in terms of population fertility rates. So let's look at some of the numbers. So this is the pyramid for a place like Somalia, still fast growing, fertility rate of 5.4. That is easily in the stage 2 category. Niger, population stage 2, explosive growth 6.9. So that's basically 7 children born to a woman during her reproductive years. That's 7 children per woman during her reproductive years. So this is still, it used to be almost 8. So it has dropped quite a bit. I say over the past 10 years. It used to be 8.1 back in 2010. So even this area of the world has begun to slow down. The introduction of fertility, contraception and that kind of stuff has been introduced, and it's been more widely accepted. Here's South Africa, an area that has decidedly slowed down, stage 4. TFR of 2.2. So notice the big difference between that and that. And here's a place where the legacy of HIV/AIDS is a big deal. This is stage 3, but interrupted. Notice how the female population is different than the male population. So this has been disrupted as a function of that. And then into the future, you see how the pyramid isn't symmetric like it should be. This is symmetric. The male and female side are approximately the same. That is pretty symmetric with the exception of that. And these are the numbers, and I just highlight the total fertility, and the numbers are still pretty high, anywhere in the average of around 4.5 for the region. Some places are still pretty high, like South Sudan, like Chad, like Angola, like Niger, but they're dropping. And in fact, these numbers are of 2018. The numbers I gave you here are 2020 numbers. So notice how Niger 2020 is 6.9, but here 7.6, and this is in 2018. So it's made a significant decrease in just a few years. So it's decidedly going down. And that's the average, 5 region-wide, but declining, especially in urban areas. This is the idea of the global birth rate. Notice where it is highest, and notice where it is lowest. Can you see a pattern? This is where death rates are high. Now, death rates are a different ballgame altogether. Europe has high death rates. We in the US are about to have high death rates. It really has nothing to do with the fact that we are unhealthy or Europe. It has everything to do with the fact that we're getting older. And as we get older, naturally death rate would increase. Here is an interesting statistic that I like to show. It's not in your book, but I like to introduce it anyway. And this is the idea of maternal mortality ratios. That is the number of moms that die per 100,000 births. And notice a difference between Sub-Saharan Africa and developed countries. So it's really the single biggest disparity between the more developed and less developed regions of the world. Even in the most rural of settings in the United States, if a woman is pregnant, she can have access to a relatively good hospital and set of doctors that can tend to her if she's having complications with her pregnancy. That's not the case in many parts of Africa. If in many parts of Africa, for example, the idea of a breached birth, that is when the baby doesn't turn to go head first out of the birth canal, that's called a breached birth. And oftentimes it leads to C-section. Well, in many parts of the world where that healthcare is not readily available, it could possibly mean the death of the mom and the baby, because the baby, humans are not supposed to come out feet first. That's just not the way we come out. So that's a big health disparity. And in the developed world, there's a very simple blood chemical marker that can be tested for that says, oh, the baby has adjusted him or herself to come out the way we're supposed to come out. So this is a really big disparity between those two areas of the world. And notice the difference, South Asia, and these numbers are changing. These are all dropping, that's dropping, all these are dropping. But even though this is now a slightly dated graphic, it's still dropping, but it's still really big difference between all these areas and developed countries like the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, Australia. Again, a different way of looking at it. I don't need you to remember any of these numbers. I just want you to think of the pattern that you see. HIV/AIDS, this is getting significantly better. HIV/AIDS, AIDS is no longer a disease you have to die from. There are so many really, really good medical treatments out there that can essentially render a person, man or woman, straight, gay, doesn't matter. He or she can basically live a normal, healthy life, even though he or she may be HIV positive, as a result of those cocktails that you can take. You can basically live, and they call it, HIV positive undetectable. So while you may be actually HIV positive by taking all these medications, you're essentially unable to show that you are, because they just basically, they work that well, and it's made a tremendous difference to anyone who is HIV positive, because you can essentially live out your life normally. Now, you have to partake in these medications. You can't just stop taking them, but it has made a tremendous difference. But the legacy of HIV/AIDS, we're talking about the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s, shows that some parts of Africa, specifically Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, Mozambique, and some other areas of Sub-Saharan Africa have had high infection rates. And this sort of shows up in life expectancy of some countries, and also in what are some of the social and economic implications. So this is, again, an older graphic. So this is Botswana in 2020. So it's, the idea of the percentage with AIDS and without. So it's a significant portion of the population. Ebola was an illness that really affected a very small but significant area of equatorial Africa in 2014 and 2015. Ebola, or hemorrhagic fever, is a disease that isn't passed on through coughing. You actually there has to be sort of liquid on skin kind of contact. And I'm not going to get into the graphic details of it, but it was a big deal in Africa during 2014 and 2015. And in fact, during those 2 years, Africa experienced its highest outbreak of Ebola ever recorded. Here's the idea of what's called Swidden agriculture. That's the slash and burn agriculture, which is something we talked about during the lesson in Latin America. But that is when you literally burn a section of land, you burn it down, you basically nutrify the soil, you plant it, and then you sow seeds, and then you harvest. But then over time, that land becomes less and less productive, so you move on to another area. So it's a very destructive to the environment. It's not a particularly good set of procedures to take part in, but it has climate change implications, because you're burning all kinds of trees and dumping all that carbon into the atmosphere. And so it's a very destructive set of habits to get into. Let's look at linguistic diversity. Lots and lots of different languages. There are official languages in the area, from English, French, Portuguese, Spanish. This stems from colonial times, but there's lots and lots and lots of tribal languages that you find here. Religious diversity, well, the northern half of Africa and the hook or the horn of Africa is mostly Muslim, but then as you head into what would have been Spanish, Portuguese, French, and British, then you get into the Christian side of Africa. And mixed in here is also local and native religions or tribal religions. Of course, you can't get away without talking about the idea of the globalization in African culture in the form of the slave trade, which, as we mentioned last lesson or 2 lessons ago, the majority of it went into Brazil, but then some of it went into what we call French Caribbean, British Caribbean, Spanish America, the British in North America, and the Dutch in the Caribbean. So that is a legacy that is impossible to get away from, and it really colors a lot of the cultures and traditions that you find in places like Brazil and in present-day Latin America, Mexico, Central America, the southern United States, the Caribbean. Let's see, let's talk about the idea of the European imprint, something you can't get away from. German, Portuguese, Belgian, Italian, British, French, Spanish. That is essentially what you find in Africa, even to this day, in some of the languages that are spoken. And then, of course, the superimposed boundaries. So basically, the European colonial reorganization of African space, which took place in the late 1800s to early 1900s. These are what some of the actual cultural boundaries of Africa should look like. It's super complicated patchwork of rather small tribal boundaries. Superimposed on the little hash mark here would be the countries that we know today, like Mali and Nigeria and Libya, in Algeria, in Egypt, in South Africa. In reality, the tribal boundaries probably mean more to them. And so you have a country that may have within it, like say Cameroon, right here, which would be right about here, is literally filled with tribal boundaries. And sometimes these tribes don't like each other and they speak different languages. So you've basically forced people of different backgrounds together. And in a world of multicultural and diversity and all that, that's all great, but it doesn't always work. And that's been the case in the Africa that we know today. Again, these little boundaries have been shoved into a modern patchwork, which is the Africa that we see today. Okay, so again, the political conflict stems from a lot of these. Piracy, we talked about that in the eastern side of the continent. Ethnic conflicts, and the legacies of colonial boundaries, which you really can't get away from. So that's what I have for you. I'm going to stop the lesson here. Again, it's a very complicated area. There are videos for you to watch that I hope help supplement some of the material that is being discussed. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Talk to you soon. Bye.